Hey, everybody. Welcome to Growing Whole, my new series. I'm so excited today to be here with Ashton Applewhite. Ashton is, hello, Ashton. She's an internationally recognized expert on ageism, the author of This Chair Rots, a Manifesto Against Ageism, and co-founder of the Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse. She speaks widely at venues that have included the TED Main Stage and the United Nations, and is a leading spokesperson for the emerging movement to raise awareness of ageism and to dismantle it. Ashton, such a treat to be with you today.
Thanks, Raven. Pleasure to be here.
You know, Ashton, this book was like a slow motion gut punch for me.
Well, now everyone can't wait to run out and buy it.
I wonder, is that a common response? Was that your intention? Tell me about that.
Well, do you mind if I put the shoe on the other foot and say why, so that I can speak to what other people said, put it in context? Why a gut punch?
I would. Oh, you're asking me why I got punch? I was, I mentioned to you before we went live that I'm in a pretty conscious community here. We celebrate our elders, and we even, celebrate moving into cronehood as women. So I was shocked at all of the issues that were underneath the surface for me. I would not have said I was, I knew that I was somewhat ageist toward myself mostly.
Yeah.
My, getting older, but I did not know how deeply it went.
This stuff goes deep. Thank you for that. I hope you didn't mind me putting you on the spot. Yeah, it is my, I don't think anyone has described it as a gut punch, but a lot of people say, oh crap, I had no idea how ageist I was. And there is no comment that I think is better or more apt, because, as the saying goes, as I'm sure you and your community know, all change starts within. If we start by changing ourselves, and then to some degree, in whatever capacity, depending on the situation, our privilege, where we are in life, et cetera, we carry that change out in the world. So the first and most necessary and most unpleasant step is to look at our own attitudes towards age and aging. And we are all ageist. There, negative messages about age and aging are drummed into us, starting with children's books. There's a fantastic site called A is for Aging that just tackles that in non-ageist children's books. Speaking of crones, the crone is a figure of great power, but also can be, the don't get me started on Disney movies, the evil crone, which is also a powerful person with great wisdom, or the placid granny, just rocking in her chair. And it's very gendered also. We don't like women to be angry, and we like granny to be sort of chipper and cheerful and not too much trouble in the corner. And so, of course, we internalize these beliefs, just as we internalize beliefs about gender roles and about people of different ethnicities. It's in the air around us. And unless we stop to challenge them, they become part of our identity. And with age and aging, these are new ideas to most of us. So, of course, we're biased. And of course, there's that moment of, oh, crap. But I will say that the next step is proportionate to the gut punch. The more you feel like, oh, geez, I am part of the problem, which we all are, then the next thing that happens inevitably is that you start to see these values replicated in the world around you. You start to notice what's on billboards, what's on TV shows, what's in the greeting card aisle, what people say. And then you see, oh, it's not me. It's not my fault that I am a bad person, or allowed myself to get wrinkles, or am, horribly biased and an awful person. No. It's in the culture around us, right? And it's a social and political issue that we can come together and do something about. So I'm thrilled that you have embarked on step one, because step two is on its heels. And I think we're already on step two, or you wouldn't have called me. And I don't mean to imply it's like a Monopoly game where there's a fixed set of steps, but that's how it begins.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that explanation. And I know that you began this journey by facing your own ageism. And it was rooted in some really common fears. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, I can. And yeah, I used to start. I mean, I started writing about this. I knew nothing about it. You know, I got no training as a gerontologist or anything, but I realized I was afraid of getting old.
Mm-hmm.
And so it began as a project inspired by my in-laws, who were in their 80s at the time and were booksellers. And they said, why don't you write about something that people ask us all the time? So when are you going to retire? So I started interviewing people over 80 who worked, which in hindsight was just a really safe way to go near the scary old thing and aging thing, because they were people who were continuing to be in the world the way they always had been. So I was aware that was kind of a little bit of a cheat, but it got me researching longevity and meeting tons of interesting older people. And it's always a good idea to interview people that represent the community that you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And just realized within a matter of, felt like weeks, honestly, that what I thought I knew about what it was like to be really old was way off base or flat out wrong. Just way too negative or not nuanced enough. And, you know, one was, I used to say that my biggest fear was ending up drooling in some awful institutional hallway. I don't say that anymore because my niece, who's a physician, called me and said, Auntie, a lot of my patients drool and they really don't like it and they're embarrassed by it. And I wish you wouldn't say that anymore. So I was like, got it. And I don't say that anymore. But I learned at the time, you know, the data, and none of this data is obscure. It's floating right there at the top of the internet and a million, you know, top flight research journals. Percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes, not all of senior living, but nursing homes. Mm-hmm. At the time I started this project 15 years ago was 4.5%. Mm-hmm. It's down to 2.5%. And I have since heard that it is less than 1%. So throughout this, it's not that our fears are without justification. I am not some positive aging Pollyanna. It's all going to be great. You know, some parts of it are going to suck, but it's never going to be as bad as our unexamined fears, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really important to tell both sides of the story. That's the thing.
Exactly. Well, you know, there's an opposite dynamic where, you know, people might say, those people out there, I don't know who, I'm sure nobody listening would say this, but that would never happen to me. You know, I'll never need care. I'll never have bad knees. I'll never be spoon fed. And that happens to other sad people. This would be ableism, wouldn't it?
That's a great question, which no one has ever asked me. Congratulations.
Oh.
Yeah, but it is something I started thinking about a lot more in the wake of COVID, because one of the reasons COVID got entrenched everywhere in the world so rapidly was because of the early messaging around the virus. Don't worry. It's only going to kill old people and sick people. And sick is a proxy for disabled in that context. Not all some disabled people have chronic illness, but lots of disabled people will assure you they are not sick. But ableism is discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of physical and cognitive ability. And an awful lot of what we think of as ageism, I'm, you know, afraid to get old, don't want to think about it, is actually apprehension. Again, some piece of which is legit about physical and or cognitive decline. And here again, you know, there are only two inevitable bad things about getting older for everyone. People you've known all your life are going to die, and some part of your body is going to fall apart. No one, no matter how much kale you do, how much money you spend on supplements, you know, and how lucky you happen to be. Luck. No one talks about luck. Still, you know, your body isn't going to work the way it used to. Cognitive decline is not inevitable. About 20% of people escape it completely. Think about those sharp 90-year-olds, you know. But, you know, that does happen. And it is important not to be in denial about it. And there's this tremendous sort of dogma in the US and the West, I would say, about successful aging is actually one of the terms, which I can't stand because it's a bogus binary, you know, that sets us up to fail, in which we are aging successfully to the degree to which we continue to look and move like younger versions of ourselves. Right. And sooner or later, we can't. And then you feel like a failure, right? You're competing all the time, especially women, because of the emphasis on our appearance. And it also costs money. It puts people who cannot afford personal trainers and kale and leisure and all those things that help us age successfully, in quotes, and leaves, it just exacerbates the inequality that we know is a huge problem in this society.
Right. Wow. So, you talk about cultural expectations here in North America in your book being, I guess, less healthy or less rich toward aging than other cultures, and you actually compare it to Latin America. I think some of their customs there. Would you share more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I should say I am not an expert in ageism in other countries. Most of my research is based in the US and Britain and Western Europe. So my data about the rest of the world is anecdotal. But I do remember I was in Brazil in the small town, really. And on Saturday night, they put out the speakers in this, big plaza, and everyone is out there, from babies to people in their 80s and 90s. That particular town was way less age segregated. In the US, pretty much the only time you see all ages together is at a family, holidays, sporting events, even, sometimes in the park, but even music and cultural events tend to be age segregated. So, when the generations are all running around together, it's much harder to hang on to stereotypes about what old people or young people are like. Just like if you're, if you encounter people who have different sexual orientations or different skin colors, it's, mixing it up is a natural antidote to stereotyping and prejudice. People always look wistfully eastward and want to know, like, isn't it better, in Asia? There are different answers to that. There are cultures, indigenous cultures here in the US as well, that do value their ancestors. A lot of people, were cultures with a tradition of Confucianism, of ancestor worship, do venerate their ancestors. But those traditions are under attack from globalization, from capitalism, because people leave the villages and move into the cities, which then causes age segregation, industrialization. So those are mega trends that are eroding those values in Asia, but for which we have solutions, we have antidotes. And I think it's important to realize, although I think some people, older people, aren't so happy when I say this, perhaps, but a society that puts older people on a pedestal is often not a great society in which to be young. In my ideal universe, older people would not have more value than young people. We might get a closer place to the fire because we tend to be colder. We might get offered a seat sooner because our knees might hurt, but they might not. Might be the young woman who's 6 months pregnant who needs the chair more than It's ageist and ableist to think that older people are more incapacitated physically just because of their age. So ask. Right? Ask if the person would like a chair. And if they say no, believe them. So part of that is, I think a society where every person has individually is seen as a valuable person, a valuable member of the community, and where age does not confer greater status or lesser status. Right? Just like white skin shouldn't confer more privilege or less privilege. Ideally, we would look at each human being and be able to assess, what they're like, what they're good at, whether you have enough in common to become friends with them or, not so much. But age is so irrelevant to that.
And ageism obviously affects different communities in different ways, right? It affects women in a different way than men. LGBTQ plus communities, Black communities, brown communities. Tell us a little bit about that.
I can only speak to my experience as a cis straight white woman. So what I know the most about is about the intersection of ageism and sexism. I do think it's one of the many interesting things about ageism is that it is the one prejudice that every human being experiences, because ageism cuts both ways. It is any judgment on the basis of age, and young people experience a lot of it too. You're too young for that, or how could you possibly? I mean, I remember, I haven't luckily so far spent a lot of time in the hospital, but I did go in for a kidney infection a while ago, and I remember looking around and thinking, oh my God, everyone is 12, and and not thinking, honestly, I've done enough work, like not thinking they wouldn't know where my kidney was without a textbook, but it's like, oh, I'm actually like I'm a lot older than I was the last time I was here, and they are doctors, right? But that assumption, I want someone who's more experienced, that would be ageist on my part, right? We age in relation to others. So it's important to ideally look at the fact that this is a form of discrimination that everyone experiences, and that we move into and out of age privilege. Unless you're trans, I believe, most of us, in terms of our skin color, our ethnicity, our sexual orientation, are what we are throughout life. And that's a fixed aspect of our identity. But age is interesting in that it changes. But of course, the way a, older Black lesbian experiences both ageism and racism and sexism is different from the way I experience it, and different from the way a younger Latinx, man approaches it. Each of our experiences is unique.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder, Ashton, what happens to this $1 trillion anti-aging industry? What happens with that, and how can we actually make a cultural shift when that we are at war with that?
Well, a point I make in my TED Talk is, and all the time, is that you can't make money off satisfaction, right? We know we have a lot to learn, I think, from the body acceptance movement here, which is really paving the way. As long as we, especially women, but again, it plays out for men also. It plays out differently in the LGBTQ community, and differently for men and women, in that there's tremendous emphasis on our appearance, which is seldom our friend, no matter what the context is. Think of all these very young kids on Instagram all the time, just agonizing about whether their everything is as perfect as the next 6,000. It's in my opinion not super healthy, although I'm not a teenage Instagram expert. As long as we believe that there is something wrong with our bodies because we might have lumps where there shouldn't be, or no lumps where we want lumps, or wrinkles, to state the obvious, we are failing to achieve some norm that the beauty industry, and that frankly, capitalism, that employers, the whole system wants us to conform to. And it is, again, a function of individual acts, each one of us, and it's not easy. And it has to be, it's the work of a lifetime engaged in with others, needs to learn to be more accepting of the way we look. Let's look more generously at ourselves and each other. And, to speak, in a gendered way, who are women's harshest critics? Other women. By far. I mean, when there's a, clickbait article about some woman who's had, all kinds of public plastic surgery, no judgment. If that's what you need to do to feel good about yourself in the world, we each have to do these things in our own way. But typically, if there is a quote from the husband, he's like, I love Myrna just the way she is. It's generally not the men who love us, again, speaking in heteronormative terms, who are demanding this. We demand it of ourselves because of this message, especially for women, that we are constantly lacking. And the anti-ageism industry exploits that. But it can only exploit us with our consent if we agree to it. So it is a function of each of us individually rejecting this idea that we are losing value as human beings as we age, that we are not desirable because we do not conform to some perfect, thin, blonde, young norm. And, I like to point out that if for the sake of this example, like the goal is to be sexually desirable and sexually active, which it doesn't need to be. You can hang up your toe shoes, no, there's no standard, there's no right way. But if you look at the people, who are sexually active, they are not the thinnest. They're not the youngest. They're not the straightest. They're not the blondest. They are the people who know their lovers are lucky. They are the people who have beaten back this narrative that you need to conform to this standard that the anti-aging industry needs us to believe in. And the hell with that. It's hard. It's not easy. I wake up in the mirror sometimes and go, what the hell happened? We all do. But I try not to dwell there.
Right. Well, do you see, and I know your work is toward this end, but do you see, or can you imagine a day when wrinkles and gray hair and maybe slower, more thoughtful speech is seen as a beautiful embodiment of deep wisdom and a beautiful thing?
I think it's not binary. I suspect in your crone communities, you have already achieved that. I think, I think paradoxically, the pandemic, I had this like vision one day of the year of letting our hair go gray and everyone going gray together. And I'm only talking about women who dye their hair just to cover the gray and don't like doing it. You want to dye your hair, more power to you. You want to dye your hair purple, whatever. But an awful lot of women dye their hair because they feel like they have to. And then the pandemic delivered that opportunity. Believe it or not, I don't know if you've seen old pictures of me. I bleached my hair white. I used to put white in it. And in the pandemic, my gray grew out. I would feel like a hypocrite talking about this if people didn't know that but I shouldn't be defensive about it. I should feel like, no, y'all should just believe my word for it or not. If I want to dye my hair, I want to dye my hair. But I do think, surely tons of women who have gone gray during this past year when they did not have. And so the more of us there are and who feel okay about it. And there's also tons of women who the minute they could get to a salon went back to dyeing their hair. We each got to do what we each got to do. But the more of us who are visible in the world as older people and older women in particular, the more the world sees how many we are, how beautiful we are, how diverse we are, how powerful we are, how skilled we are. And when we dye our hair to cover the gray or leave early accomplishments off our resume or fudge our age, no judgment, we make ourselves invisible as older people. And when a group is invisible, so are the issues that affect us. So only until or as more and more and more of us refuse to do those things that hide us and marginalize us will we change the culture.
May it be so. Wow. And just let me point out, and I shouldn't have to do this either, but I do not dye my hair, but it's hard to tell in this lighting. Your work is not without criticism.
Always a good sign.
I saw a review, and you actually shared it on your Facebook page with a great comment that I won't repeat because it was your personal page, but it was by a man who took some issue with your work. So ageism, it affects every single person. So you would think that this was definitely an ism that everyone could get behind. Why do you feel that there is some pushback?
Well, you can share what he said. I can't remember. I mean, if you want to.
It was a British reviewer, I think.
That guy.
Yeah. You had a great comment about it. But anyway. So what is the pushback? Where does this come from?
I think people don't want, it depends on the individual person. I mean, I can't remember exactly what he said, only, people, white men in particular, shocker, are, hugely unaware of their own male privilege and white privilege. And I think that ageism is somehow lesser or minor, or I think there's actually not so much criticism from younger activists as sort of not paying any attention to the need to make ageism To add it to the list of all the prejudices that oppress us, to make age a criterion for diversity. Hello, because age seems less important. And it is a trap to think this way. It is a trap to weigh one form of oppression against another for two reasons. One, we've already touched on, we experience it, even though you and I are, in a lot of ways are similar, ethnically, vaguely, gender, age-ish, whatever, we still, you experience all sorts of things different from me. So, for all I know, you're sitting in a wheelchair, for example, right? For all you know, I'm caring for 6 people with Alzheimer's. We don't know about another person's experience. Also, because it sets 3 reasons that it sets us up to compete. I don't have time to be anti-racist because I'm busy being anti-ageist. All these forms of prejudice compete and reinforce each other. They all need each other to survive, right? Because they all that's the fundamental premise of intersectionality. All these forms intersect and compound each other in different ways in each of our individual lives. By the same token, the flip side of that, which is a little less daunting, is that any activism, any awareness is intersectional too. The minute, let me presume to speak for you, you realize like, oh, my own attitudes that I never thought of it are complicit in ageism and in reinforcing ageism in the world. You might have also said, gee, maybe, or when it comes up, maybe I have some racism in me that I'm not aware of either, that could be operating in the world in ways I'm not aware of, right? So it chips away at the fear and ignorance that underlie any prejudice. So it's always super important. I mean, I think there's some idea that ageism is more elite or less important or more natural, and none of those things are true, right? I mean, I think fear, you hear, well, old people are reminders of mortality. We're going to die anyway. Everyone's afraid of dying, so it's okay to be freaked out by aging. I don't buy that one. It's true that older people are reminders of mortality. There's always a grain of truth, but aging is living. We are aging from the minute we're born. It's not just something annoying old people do. And someone might look at me and think I'm ancient, but they don't think I'm dying. Right? The conflation of aging and dying is itself a function of ageism in society. There's nothing natural about it.
Right. Wow. So you reminded me of the last live workshop I taught on Hermetic wisdom. It's all been online, in recent times, but we looked at the principle of polarity, and we looked at a lot of polarities, but we looked at life and death, did a pretty deep dive into death and our fears of death. And, the principle of polarity says that opposites are just extremes of the same thing. One can't exist without the other. So it was interesting when we really kind of got into that, looking at our fears of death, that those fears could be whittled down to a fear of not really fully living, or a fear of actually living our purpose, or a fear of, not having enough time to do what we came to do. It was an interesting thing, because our fears about one polarity can always be applied to the other one. And so a fear of life, which a lot of us do have this weird underlying thing. I wonder, what are your thoughts about your own fears about death, and how have you come to terms with that? And did you find any similarities? Did you find a fear of living in there anywhere?
Fear of living, I have to say, is a phrase so general that I would have to see what the individual is and what it is about their circumstances or their view of the future that's at issue. Another of the misconceptions I started out with, along with we're all going to end up drooling in a retirement home, was I thought, well, getting older is clearly awful. And one of the things that makes it awful is that we get closer to death. And it must be, in addition to the, loss of capacity and I had literally had this mental vision of the shadow of the grim reaper leaning over the sad iron bedstead in which the withered old person sat there. Because, you would know, and it is true, each day, I brings each of us closer to death. And if you have more road behind you than ahead, like me, I'm rounding the third turn on the track for sure, right? And then I learned that the older people are, the less they fear dying. It's usually a function of people a little older than I am, but again, it's individual. But people, as we get older, we get better at living in the moment, at appreciating the present. That is what confers contentment for the most part. It's why people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. Who knew? That was another thing. You don't believe me? My mother-in-law, the same one. She was like, I don't believe that. I was like, Ruth, saying thank you for taking issue with the best substantiated statistic. So Google U curve of happiness if you think I'm smoking crack on that one. But older people don't want to die. And they especially don't want to die in pain, but they spend a lot less time worrying about it. There was a big study out of Cornell that it's called the Legacy Project. And Dr. Carl Pillemer interviewed tons of older people about advice they had for younger people. And the takeaway was, don't worry so much. Don't worry so much. And especially don't worry about dying. So I will say that, I'm 68. I figure odds are I have a while to go. I don't try to not think about it, but I don't think about dying much. And being sort of a super rational, thinky person, I worry about it less than I used to, or when I do think about it, I am less fearful about it, because I figure if life is a pizza and, only one small slice of the pizza worries about dying, I am likely to fall in the bigger part of the pizza. And that is likely to be true for me as well.
Wow. Good point. On page 232 in your book, for those who have it that are listening, and if you don't have it, order it right now. You share some places to start. There are a lot of suggestions, 2.5 pages, I think. What are the top ones that you can share now? Where does someone start to dismantle ageism?
Start where you started. But you don't have to read the book. I should say that my website is thischairrocks.com, and I have been thinking out loud in blog form since I started this. So it's searchable by topic, or, listen to other interviews with me, or blah, blah, blah. Watch my TED Talk. It's 11 minutes. You'll learn a lot.
Right.
But is to do what we started out this conversation talking about. Look at your own attitudes towards age and aging. And one pretty sort of simple way to do that is think about how you use the words old and young, right? And do you use old to mean, people say, I don't feel old. What they really mean is, I don't feel useless. I don't feel incompetent. I don't feel physically vulnerable. Well, you can feel any of those things at any age, right? Just like you can feel, their opposite. I don't know about you, but when I was 13, I felt less competent and more ugly and less sure of myself than I ever have since. So use the actual attribute, the lonely, happy, sexy, incompetent, use that word and strip it from age, because it doesn't have to do with age. We hitch so many things to age unintentionally because of our unexamined ageism. Does your arms hurt? I have arthritis in the shoulder. It does hurt. But, it could also hurt because I cooked dinner for 6 people. Does your other arm hurt? Do you blame aches and pains on aging when aging may have nothing to do with it? And think about also, it's really, really important to make and keep friends of all ages. Just like ideally we would have friends of different races and different sexual orientations, just because that enlarges our worldview and, keeps us from being prejudiced. So when you get to a social event, do you make a beeline for people your own age? Try and break that habit.
Wow.
And think about why that's hard. Like, what's that about? Right. Because I think, my suspicion is we might think as older people, like, oh, those young people, they're not going to want some, middle-aged person, going over. Well, they probably won't care. Some of them will be delighted, and any of them that are really going to be sniffy about that, they're never going to change the culture. But you will by going over there.
Wow. Okay. You had a quote in the book, and I was looking at my notes. It's toward, I think it may be toward the end, but you say, imagine how much more manageable the fear of aging would be if we become old people in training when we're young. We'd live longer because attitudes about aging directly affect our health. We'd live better as well, freed of reflexive apprehension in our middle years and open to more varied, optimistic, and realistic narratives about what lies ahead. So beautiful, Ashton. How close is this vision?
It depends on each of us. The world, we live in an ageist world. We live in a racist world. Mm-hmm. We live in a highly sexist world. So we all need to work together against all those things. It depends on, on your individual circumstances, how each of them weighs on you and where you feel you can push back. Those of us with more privilege ideally would take more risks and push back more. I can't get fired. I can't lose my grants because I don't have any. No people may not buy my book, but I have very little personal and professional risk in saying whatever the hell I feel like. That's not true. I mean, I have never forgotten the woman. I used to be a little judgier, shocker. And I remember talking about covering our hair, about dyeing our hair to cover the gray, and how it was problematic. And a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, if I didn't dye my hair, my boss would see how old I am and he would fire me, and I have children to support. Wow. And she's probably right. So we each got to do this stuff in our own way and at our own time. But only when we do these things do we change the culture. And, women are leading the movement against ageism. We are braver, I think. We have more at stake. And it is absolutely, totally underway. I want people to know, you mentioned it in my bio, about something called Old School, mm-hmm. which is a clearinghouse, which just means a place where things come in and out of free, vetted anti-ageism resources. Everything's free except the books. And one of our fastest growing sections is a campaign section of, this is not how to live forever or how never to get arthritis. These are anti-ageism campaigns from everywhere around the world. I spent November 2019 in Australia, which launched this fantastic national campaign called Every Age Counts. There's also tons of smaller things happening in cities. San Francisco has a terrific one. New York City, where I live, just launched an anti-ageism campaign. So there are tons and tons of ways to educate yourself. If you don't want to buy my book, one of the things on there is the Harvard implicit bias tests, where you take a test and you can test against all kinds of bias. There's more kinds of bias than I ever knew existed. And, establish what, because that's often the hardest thing. We don't want to admit that we're biased. Mm-hmm. It makes us feel bad. Sure. And one thing I have learned from some anti-racism training that I've been doing is guilt. No one's interested in your guilt. That doesn't help. That doesn't help. Certainly doesn't help you, and it doesn't help move things forward. So the first brave step is to look at how your own ignorance, because we're all ignorant, and maybe, fear, apprehension of looking more directly at this stuff is standing in the way of feeling better about yourself. I mean, I guarantee if you read my book, you will feel better about the years ahead. And it's not because I'm some kind of Pollyanna saying bad shit is never going to happen to you.
Right. Yeah. So go for the slow gut punch. That was a little extreme. Fabulous book. Everybody needs to read it. In fact, I think it was the Washington Post that said the 100 best books that people of every age should read.
Yeah.
It's fabulous. Ashton, your boldness and your authenticity really gives all of us, it inspires that in each of us. And so we really owe you a debt of gratitude. Thank you so much for your truly sacred work in the world. This is really powerful work, and you're so appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being with us, everybody. Please go to thischairrocks.com. Ashton also has a blog called Yo, Is This Ageist? Where you can actually ask her if particular things that you experience or see are ageist. Chances are.
Not always, but chances
Not
are.
always. Not always. Again, everyone, please visit her website, thischairrocks.com, follow her work, order her book, and click subscribe below. We'll have more interviews coming up on Growing Whole. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.